Hello, my name is Dan Ruminski, and I've become known as a storyteller. I suppose to most that wouldn't mean much, so let me explain. I have become very passionate about early Cleveland, Ohio history. In particular, kind of post-Civil War, dates about 1875 through about 1929. And the reason I've become very interested is because during this period, Cleveland was known as the greatest city in the world. We had the grandest street in the world, known as Millionaire's Row or Euclid Avenue. This was called the greatest street not by just anyone, but none other than Mark Twain when he visited on several occasions. My passion grew because as I examined this period, I found things that could be extrapolated and applied to Cleveland today to make us again a great city. And through word of mouth, what has occurred is I've been invited to many libraries and many municipal and corporate events to talk about this history. And in doing this, we've kind of formed a mission statement to use this history to generally promote Cleveland, to have people appreciate how great we were through example, and also to take a hard look at some of the great innovation that took place during this period in Cleveland that had worldwide impact, which really caused us to be the great city that we were. Besides talking about Millionaire's Row, one of my favorite talks is talking about white motors and white sewing machine. If you're like our family, probably a great-grandmother or grandmother may have even owned a white sewing machine and appreciated its value. We went on to, from white sewing machine, where the three sons formed White Motors. And again, you talk about innovation, and they invented a combination gas and steam car. Very appropriate today when all of us are turning green. This was very economical, lower horsepower, and was the best in the world at the time. Fascinating little story about Thomas Howard White, who was president of White Sewing Machine, and how he raised his kids, or his sons. The youngest son was Walter White, and there's an incident that took place on their mansion in Millionaire's Row early on where Walter, as a young fellow, observed his older brothers playing with their boats in a little pond on Euclid Avenue. If you drive down Euclid today, it's hard to visualize that such a pond would even exist, but indeed it did. This was considered country at about East 86th Street before the turn of the century. And Walter, observing his brothers, didn't have a boat, approached his father, Thomas Howard, and suggested, "Father, I deserve a boat." And in classic style, Thomas Howard White, his father, answered in the negative and indicated no. Walter, being the youngest and very aggressive, thought about this and came back to his father a couple days later, as we understand it, and told his father that if you won't get me a boat, then I'm going to build my own boat. And the classic response, which I think is appropriate even today, by Thomas Howard was, "Son, I will buy you a grand set of tools." This is a teaching moment, but it also showed why this training paid off in marvelous innovation down the road. Cleveland firsts fill up a book, from chewing gum to gas mask to traffic light to arc lighting to the starting of such companies as General Electric, Western Union, and so on and so forth. Again, not a secret that innovation is going to be a big, huge part in driving Cleveland forward. Most people don't understand the scope. Millionaire's Row was over 250 mansions, and at one point really went from Public Square out past the Cleveland Clinic. Very quickly, as commercial began to develop, it moved back to East 6th and then East 9th, out past the clinic. Early on in the late 1800s, if you were out at East 86th Street or East 90th, this was still considered a country. And a lot of homes were built out that far to enjoy the country, but yet still have access to downtown. One of the fascinating things that people latch onto when I talk about Millionaire's Row are the size of these houses. And on average, they were about 25,000 square feet. Gigantic. And again, not just one, but one after another, at one point numbering over 250. Largest home ever built on Millionaire's Row was built by John D. Rockefeller's partner, Sam Andrews, and his home was over 50,000 square feet. It took a staff of over 100 people to manage this, and in building it for $3 million over a 2-year period, they found after a short time, less than 2 years, that the house was unmanageable, and they really picked up and vacated and moved to New York to their apartment on Fifth Avenue. So the fascinating part about this story, and this happened often, spent $3 million, took 2 years to build, found it wasn't suitable, and just picked up and abandoned it. Now, in the abandonment, they didn't let it go to waste. They pretty much kept a skeleton crew aboard to maintain it in a suitable fashion, and then eventually tore it down. Even the billionaires today don't do that kind of thing, and there are numerous examples on Millionaires Row of this happening. Folklore suggests that many of the millionaires had their homes torn down after they died for the purpose of not having anybody else live in them. This is somewhat not true. Basically, several of them, such as Brush and Hanna and Rockefeller, did have their homes torn down, but their fear was that Euclid Avenue was becoming commercialized, and they did not want their homes to be converted into a commercial entity. So to preclude that happening, they would actually have the home torn down. But a lot of the mansions did go commercial. A lot of them were not torn down at the death of the particular family that lived there. The fascinating thing about Millionaires Row, and maybe the fascinating thing about this whole period, as you could tell from my opening dates, 1875 to 1929, it was a relatively short period of time in Cleveland history. So when you look at the tremendous growth, the tremendous fortunes that were made, this tremendous Millionaires Row, and you look at the time frame, that is fascinating to me. And it tells me that if we really get serious about rebuilding Cleveland and look at this period, we can turn things about in a fairly quick period of time. The other thing that comes from this period, which is somewhat fascinating to me, was that upon making these fortunes, most of the people felt that they had to give back to society. I kind of compare it as almost being in their DNA. And they taught their children that you had an obligation to give back. And as a result, Cleveland not only had grand innovation and industry, but we had a grand social and arts center. Our Western Reserve Historical Society, our Botanical Gardens, our Cleveland Orchestra, basically our art museum, and our colleges and universities that are here are all products of these people, for the most part, that lived on Millionaires Row, that felt strongly that once they made their fortunes, they had to give back to society. They also did great work with hospitals, dealing with the indigent. Sam Mather with his university hospital, Dudley Wick with his Huron Road Hospital, very dedicated to making medical available to the poor, and spent a good bit of their time doing this. They also spent a good bit of time with their churches, and the beauty of Millionaires Row and Euclid Avenue was that the grand churches were innovated right in the neighborhood. Today, as we live, we may not want a gigantic church right next to us for maybe obvious reasons, noise and parking and traffic. This was not the case on Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row. Churches were within walking distance. There were many, many churches of grandeur. Architecture somewhat fit the architecture on the avenue, as the great architects were not only builders of the houses, but also builders of the church. For example, Sam Mather built Trinity Cathedral in 1910, the same year he built his home, which is still there and still part of Cleveland State University. Basically, same architect, Charles Schweinfurth, designed both. There's kind of a cute story about Mather and building the church, and when they budgeted and raised the money, the architect Schweinfurth came forward to Mather and said that basically you're about $1 million short, and I suggest we eliminate the chapel, or the bell tower, not chapel, but bell tower temporarily, until we raise the money and we can retrofit this. Mather, after thinking about this, felt that the tower and the bell chapel was so important that to stage this was not the proper thing to do. So as folklore has it, he contacted his personal secretary and asked her to write a check from his personal account for $1 million. Gives you some idea of the wealth of the period, and in particular Sam Mather. The interesting thing about this story was that his secretary came back and indicated to Mr. Mather, quote, "Mr. Mather, which personal account do you want me to take that out of?" So obviously he had more than one with $1 million sitting there. Again, the grandeur of the period, the purpose of when people had money and they wanted to do something, they wanted it done correctly and they wanted it done quickly. And the vast sums of money allowed them to do this. But in general, White Motors and many examples, you hear these horrific stories about how cruelly or meanly the hired help was treated, and we have example after example in Cleveland where this was not the case. White Motors, for example, they had orchestras or bands playing during the work hours, both during the day and at night, for the comfort of their workers. White Motors was hurt terrifically by not going to mass construction or automation because they felt that this would not be good for their workers. They built ceilings out of glass so that the daylight could come in, so it would be more like working within the outdoors. Very cognizant. They had special things set up for the immigrants where they could help them filling out forms and vote, and also to commissary that they sold items below cost, and ongoing education. The neighborhood was actually built around the factory, and people could walk. And what we saw at White Motors was generational. We saw father next to son next to his son, 3 generations at a time working at White Motors. And in every case, the pride of that generation and the pride of the Whites was stamped on every vehicle. This was also a nifty thing to extrapolate today. The great pride that was taken in what was built. Cleveland was the home front on just about every mecca, from law to education to steel to oil to automobile. Most people aren't aware that Cleveland started the automobile industry. We had over 100 manufacturers of automobiles here in Cleveland at one time. Now granted, they weren't automated and they weren't building thousands of vehicles, but many of these climbed to a period of building over 1,000 vehicles over a 12-month period. And the best of the best survived. Those that did not were either bought up or married with other companies. White Motors realized very quickly that automobiles was very competitive, and so they found a niche market by building trucks. World War I came along and allowed them to build over 18,000 vehicles for the war effort, and really made them the big player in the world as far as truck manufacturing. I do give a talk. I started by bringing in as many as 50 or 60 photographs from the period I'm talking about, and we put them out and engage the audience as they walk in. And then I sit down in a wing chair generally with a glass of water, and I tell them the tale, oftentimes 45 minutes to an hour. Afterwards, what we find is now the audience will go back to these pictures and sometimes spend as much as 45 minutes examining them and now putting a face to a name and taking great appreciation away. I think we Clevelanders sometimes are not cognizant of this great history, and oftentimes when we're hit with the national negative stereotype, we don't have an immediate response to that. So we invite you to contact us. Our website is www.clevelandhistorylessons.com. I am available to talk at many events, and from audiences we've seen generally these events are sold out with waiting lists, which I'm elated and humbled by, but it does show that there's tremendous interest throughout Cleveland. And I think taking the next several years and promoting and getting to know the right people to open up doors, it is my home that will find a permanent home for Cleveland, and it is my goal to build actually a virtual Millionaires Row that you can walk down and really feel what it was like to be part of Cleveland during this period. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that I'll be hearing from you soon.